Hello and welcome, Virtual Horror Con. I'm Eddy Webb. I'm here with Justin Achilli and Meghan Fitzgerald. We'll go through introductions in a moment. But we thought with all of the talk about the games that you guys are playing during this weekend, we thought we'd talk a little bit of time to discuss what it's like to actually make one of these games. Meghan, why don't you start off with introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Meghan Fitzgerald. I am currently the developer for the Changeling the Lost and Mage the Awakening Chronicles of Darkness lines for Onyx Path. I've also developed a few individual books for other lines here and there, like Scion and Exalted. And I'm currently developing also a couple of as yet unannounced projects for Green Ronin. So I've been writing for Onyx Path and other games for a while now.
Absolutely. Awesome. And Justin?
Hi, I'm Justin Achilli. I was the game developer for Vampire the Masquerade, for Vampire the Requiem, for Vampire the This and That from about 1998 through, I guess I worked on a title for Vampire as recently as 2016 on Prince's Gambit there. I've also done the development on the 3rd edition of Ravenloft for Dungeons & Dragons, as well as contributing a bunch of writing to various games here and there. I've done some developing for Changeling, for Werewolf, for other topics here and there. I'm just kind of an old dude who still hasn't learned to get out of the RPG pool.
You keep dragging me back in. I'm Eddy Webb. I've been involved with tabletop RPGs and video game writing since 2001. I was also a line developer for Vampire the Masquerade. I've worked on other projects, including my own creator-owned project, Pugmire, and I've also developed for a wide variety of projects for things like Chronicles Darkness, World Darkness, and even games like Cartoon Action Now and the like. So between all of us, we have a wide diversity of experience in developing role-playing games. The first thing I kind of want to chat about, I'd like to get you guys' thoughts on, is the term developer is kind of vaguely understood. Like, for example, if you go on, say, LinkedIn and put up developer on there, you're going to assume you're a programmer and give you programming jobs. So in your minds, what is the role of a developer for an RPG project?
Meghan, jump in there, please.
Sure.
Start with the hard ones.
I always think of developer, it's not one job, it's like 3 or 4 separate jobs that you're doing all at once. Because you have to be a project developer, you have to be sort of a creative director, you have to be an editor and a proofreader. And obviously we have actual editors for those things, but you don't want to give the editor, a completely unedited, like unproofread, I should say, manuscript. So there's part of that too. And it's just a lot of different balls to juggle. You have to be an administrator. You have to keep track of all the writers and all of their pay and when they, get that kind of, when they get paid and when they hand in things, keep track of deadlines. And it's a lot. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of different different skills that you have to bring to the table, which is why Eddy has made lots and lots of awesome kind of developer education materials for us, because bringing new people on to develop recently, it's just, it's a lot. And so I don't know, it's a lot of different jobs.
Absolutely. And one of those charts are right over there. So we'll talk about that in a minute. How about you, Justin?
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of that. It is different from being the designer in that the developer doesn't always have the idea or build the idea. The developer's job is to kind of get the idea across the line. That involves a couple of different stages, at least historically in my work at White Wolf and for Art House. I was collecting drafts. I was doing a kind of content edit on the drafts, not really a line edit, but basically, hey, let's have more of this idea, or, oh, this doesn't really fit with the thesis, let's set this aside. Then once you've got a good draft, you'll kind of pull that together and get it together for production. So it's doing things like art notes. You're not an art director, you're just kind of calling out, hey, this is really cool and would make a good visual, because the art director or the graphic designer isn't always going to have a chance to completely read the manuscript. So they're looking to you to kind of steer them toward producing the visual elements for them, not actually making the visual elements, but hey, this would be cool. And then you're doing things all the way through the end of production till it goes to the end user or distribution or the store. Things like doing printer checks, doing proofs of the books, making sure that this page isn't duplicated on the back of this page. Sometimes there's some 11th hour. This is a 96-page book, and yet you're at 100 pages. So you've got to make decisions like, okay, well, do we cut 4 pages or do we bump it up to 128 pages? At which point the art director and graphic designer murder you and try to resolve that problem. But I think probably the big distinction there is the developer is not always the designer. The developer does a lot of design work. The developer can be the designer, but those are not necessarily the same things.
I think those are all really good points. The one thing I'd really add to that is a lot of times when people kind of ask me what it is, they assume that a lot of a developer's job is equivalent to, like, say, a director of a film or a creative director for a video game company. And really, I feel there's a lot more producer in the role than I think a lot of people initially realize when they talk about a development position. And like Meghan said, one of the things that I have been working on with Onyx Pass specifically, and also my consultancy of companies, Pugsteady in general, has been to kind of articulate and clarify what some of these roles are. So that's why I asked Nick to put up this handy little graphic I came up with. And I'm not going to go through absolutely every step, but I wanted to kind of showcase that there are different stages, like we've kind of alluded to already. And the first one I've called design because I feel like Justin mentioned, that this is where a lot of the initial work of what the game's going to be comes before a developer kind of formally comes on board. And so it's going to be things like your pitches and your outlines. That's where, even before the pitches, where usually a lot of design work happens, but your pitch is kind of articulating this is what the design's going to be. And then the outline is how you take these core concepts and express them to the creative team that's going to carry it into actual full development. Both of you guys have written outlines and the like. Do you guys have any thoughts or tricks or things that you think people should know when they're working on their own outlines for books?
The first of which for me is, if you want to write the thing, just write the thing. Don't pretend you're writing an outline and then make everyone attempt to dance to the tune that you are playing there. If you're going to write the book, go ahead and write the damn book. Mm-hmm. The objective for an outline is to communicate at a high level to your writers. So, give them, one of the things that I really enjoy is, it sounds just super processy and nerdy, but man, bullet points are great. Mm-hmm. Say what needs to be said in the bullet point, and then you will get paragraph upon paragraph explaining that bullet point from your writer. So again, you can be the writer, but be concise as the developer. Show me, please, what you want, as opposed to, I'll know it when I see it. First and foremost, as developer, you need to be a communicator and tell me what the product or what the game is trying to do.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. How about you, Meghan?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. My outlines tend to be a little bit longer, only because I usually try to build in the my general guidelines for writers, things that I want them to do in the outline. So it's not just this book, what's in this book and what do I want out of this book, but what do I want in general? Just kind of things that I've seen come up in red lines over and over and over again that I want them to know up front. Writer guidelines, stuff like that. But I think it's interesting working for lots of different developers and then and then writing your own outlines and seeing how everybody does things a little bit differently. I know that for some projects and for some developers, they'll come up with, especially if it's a core book or if it's something that's a brand new mechanic, the developer will sort of do more of that design work upfront and then present it in the outline as the basis of the mechanics. If it's something really complicated or if it's something brand new. But then other times, if you're writing, if you're producing a Chronicles of Darkness book, those mechanics are already there and you're just adding to them. So there's not a ton of design work to do up front. I would say one thing about outlines is not just concise, but well organized. It's so much easier to follow an outline. Maybe this is just my librarian brain, I don't know, but it's so much easier to follow an outline that already has the headings in it that you want, the templates in it that you want. if you want me to write an antagonist, give me a template so that I don't have to come up with it on my own. If you want me to write an adventure, tell me what your template is for your adventure. Yeah, because like Justin said, I mean, communication to your writers is really important so that you get what you want the first time and not, the third time.
Absolutely. That's a good point. And actually, since we're kind of talking about that, I did see a question in the chat from Soul Free Wolf. Is it difficult to decide what you want to have in a core product versus in supplemental material? And I know, at least for me, a big chunk of that depends on what the limitations are in the original core product. For Pugmire, I knew I wanted specifically to have a small, concise book that was a smaller form factor. It was, no more than 256 pages. So a lot of stuff I wanted to put in the core, I ended up not, because it would defeat that, as opposed to when Justin and I are both working on, say, V20, anniversary edition. That was meant to be a big, beautiful book with as much stuff in it as possible. So, being a big 500-pound book, or 500-page book, it was 500 pounds
same
too.
thing, yeah.
It's about the same. But that was kind of the point in the design of that, was to put as much cool extra edge stuff in there as possible, so you have this nice, big, comprehensive, complete volume. What about you guys? Is there anything that you feel like you have to cut or have to add to make those cores work out?
I think when you start with a core, you don't actually know what is core and what is supplemental, especially in your first draft or your kind of prototype level product. And I say product not in terms of thinking of it like a product, but in terms of your deliverable. When your first draft exists, like, hey, maybe something like the Sabbat emerges and, oh, this doesn't fit in the core book. This is absolutely supplemental material. And one of the things that I'd like to call out here is that actually my understanding of these things, or even my desire of these things as a player, has changed over time. Like, 10, 15, 20 years ago, if you said, here's a core book, I want that 500-page book. Yep. But now if you say, hey, here's a core book you could get into, if that thing is even 256 pages, for me is like, I don't have time to read all this. Right. I'm going to go to, watch a stream of it played, or, the way we experience media has changed a lot of what's even defining core versus supplement, as opposed to traditionally, where we were making books and the book has a hard page count, of an increment of 16 pages. Like now, if you're distributing electronically, you don't even really care necessarily about page count. If it's 113 pages versus 119, it doesn't matter that you've blown your signature, because you don't have a signature.
Right. Absolutely true. And actually, that leads nicely into the next kind of phase of it, which is production, the actually making of the original manuscript. And so it's like, in my general experience, usually comes down to you get the team together of writers, you give them the outline, give as much information as possible. These days, I find there's usually some kind of meeting, whether it's on Slack or a video conference or what have you, just to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page to supplement the outline. Then you get the first draft. Drafts come back in. A developer puts a cattail in front of everybody. Little kitty. A developer does what's called redlining, which is basically giving comments and feedback and suggestions on what the writers do for the next draft. And then the final drafts kind of come in. Sometimes there's more than 2 drafts, but generally, if you have a good, strong outline, good communication at the front, and strong red lines, I feel like 2 drafts is usually sufficient to kind of get it to the next step. Do you guys feel about the same way?
Yeah, I think every once in a while, I've asked for a third draft mostly on mechanics. Just because sometimes if you're developing mechanics, what you get the first time, it's you're not necessarily playtesting everything as you go along. So right. You kind of need to see how the mechanics work out. And especially if something elsewhere in the book changed in second drafts, and then something else in another chapter needs to change to match it or something like that, I occasionally will need a third draft. But yeah, and I agree, usually 2 drafts is sufficient.
It's interesting, Eddie, that you bring this up in the context of production too, because going back to the White Wolf days, when I was part of it, we had actually built that into the schedule, right? Like, here's the first draft due date, here's the second draft due date, and that is a publication schedule. By contrast, I've worked on stuff where we built basically paper RPGs or tabletop RPGs to prototype stuff for computer games. So I've worked on, basically RPGs inside Ubisoft, and, we had 14, 15, 16 revisions of these things because we're always trying to incrementally prove, this system here, this system here, this system here. So there's a big contrast, and with each kind of edition, we were changing something, right? We were focusing on a different feature in terms of the RPG we were building there. So when something is built to be put on a shelf, as the product or as something the player is going to have in their hands, that very much needs to cleave to a production schedule. Whereas, we weren't actually printing the RPG in Ubi. So we had any amount of time through prototyping to develop a new edition of the game. So, what's the purpose? Is this something that a player is going to buy, or is this something that's intending to prove out something else? There's a place for both of those. And I think a lot of players kind of experience it from the buy a game, play a game experience.
No, totally. And that's actually a really good point, because I think the stuff you're talking about also could tie well into, like, say, indie RPG production. If this is something, one man shop that's doing absolutely everything from soup to nuts, then they can take that time to kind of really endlessly iterate as they feel necessary. But when we're talking about here developing an RPG, we're really talking about, like you say, this is going to end up as a project, and we have to count for things like writers have to eventually go on to work on other freelance projects. They can't continue to work on the same project over and over again.
And you've got to pay them, right?
Right. So, yeah, they need to get their money in. We need to make sure that we have the right balance of material in, so we can get the right amount of arts bought, and make sure that, it's like printing that 500-page book is very different cost-wise than printing a slim 128-page volume. So yeah, there's a lot of physical production considerations that come for that 2-draft structure. But I do feel like Megan said, that we have gotten it down pretty strong. I know I've inherited that kind of first and final deadline from back when we worked together, and just back in the days of the wrapping up of publishing, and carried on to Onyx Path Publishing and the other projects I work on. But it does seem like it's a decent structure to get majority stuff in. But it does bring up a larger question: is when playtesting happens, and to be blunt, sometimes if playtesting happens. I know, like, for supplements, it's not as critical, but like for a core game, especially a core game, it's a brand new game, not even like an iteration of an existing game like World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness, but like something like a Pugmire or a Trinity Continuum or a Scion with a brand new system that adds a lot of time into that. And like Megan says, sometimes you have to get everything in before you can really have a meaningful playtest. So sometimes you do have this moment of like, okay, we actually have to go back to do 3rd or 4th drafts because we didn't know what we had until it was all together in one place. That leads to another question in the chat. Calador Mythica asks, I've noticed sometimes new supplements or new additions that the formats can evolve or be revised as a game line becomes more realized and maybe a better way of presenting or expressing information. If that happens, when or can that decision be made in the process, and at what level is that decision made? And that's an interesting question. I know, like, when Justin, when you transitioned off to me, the V20 line development stuff, I made some small tweaks and adjustments to how we presented stuff in V20. But I mean, I don't know if it was more of a conscious thing so much as over time, you just look at, you see what people are responding to, like on the forums or online or on social media, or, if they're putting up a video, or even now with actual plays, how they're playing the game. And you go, oh, they're having trouble referencing this material, or they're confused at this point, and allows you to kind of make new steps. But I think that depends on, sometimes some developers just get into a nice strong structure and want to keep that structure going. Some developers will radically rechange how line bumps. I think it kind of up to the creative director. But I mean, I know both of you have worked on games that have evolved over time. Have you seen a lot of that kind of shifting happening?
I think there's no riskier statement in publishing than, well, we do it this way because we've always done it this way.
Right.
Yes.
And one of the things that I've seen firsthand for that is when we started working on V20 and we were pushing some of those early manuscripts into the kind of public evaluation phase, where we're literally just sharing Google Docs, like, hey, read this, check it out. And the feedback was coming there much more quickly and much more immediately than it ever had previously, you know, in the 90s or in the early 2000s, before, you know, the ready availability, or I guess ubiquity of internet access there, where it was pretty much make a book and it comes out, you know, when it comes out. But seeing V20, when we, you know, I remember I was putting out some of the basic rules there, and some of the feedback was, oh no, don't fix the botch rules. We want, you know, part of botching is the hilarious outcomes. Like,
oh no,
hang on, you guys want broken rules in here? Like, we know this doesn't work. Like, oh, that's part of the charm of the old world of darkness, is that, you know, every now and then the better you get at something, the more catastrophic your results. But I mean, even outside of like a rules context, getting back into the sense of production there, like you can see over time, you know, Vampire the Masquerade, through its, you know, first through 20th anniversary editions, it was, you know, 2 columns of text, and it's eminently readable, and there's a lot of well-used white space. And then by contrast, you get into Vampire the Requiem, which is kind of more artifact driven. You know, things are laid out, you know, where this is a journal entry, so it's kind of tilted at this page and it's done in a handwriting font. We did some of that in early Masquerade. And then like even up through 5th edition, where it's the books themselves, or at least the core book, is laid out less like a game book and more like a Vogue magazine. You know, so those changes there, I think, correspond to the audience, A, response, and B, the audience they're targeting. You know, like 5th edition didn't really so far have a huge amount of feedback that changed and informed the core rule book. Instead, they decided, you know, we want this to be a more glamorous layout. What makes sense in that context? Oh, a fashion magazine. So, you know, you kind of get to make those decisions with the way you're targeting your game to be used.
Absolutely. And I know, Megan, you mentioned before you kind of your library background. So have you found that as you inherited games like Chronicles of Darkness and whatnot, have you found there's an instinct to kind of recategorize information so it can be easier to kind of, for clarity and access?
Yeah, I have found that, as sometimes, you know, people will hand in a draft and I'll ask them to reorder things. But yeah, I mean, definitely, even just the general structure of what a book looks like or what information goes where. I've definitely run into where that part of my brain kicks in, and I'm like, oh, my understanding of how people absorb information and how just the interaction that people have with getting information or getting looking something up, referencing something. Definitely, you know, I've seen places where I've shifted things around. It's interesting with Chronicles of Darkness because there is that whole kind of history of, well, these books have been structured this way for a while. And I know when we were working on Changeling, Rose Bailey had a lot of good ideas for how she wanted things to be laid out. Just in general for 2nd edition Chronicles of Darkness, that all of the 2nd edition Chronicles books pretty much had the same layout, the same, I should say structure, not layout, sort of chapter structure, what information goes where. And that was, you know, her long experience of knowing how people, you know, if somebody was going to pick up a book, what was the first thing they wanted to know? Well, the first thing they wanted to know in her experience was, what is my character? Who is my character, and what do they like, and what are my options, right? And that's why in the Chronicles core books, chapter 1 is the character chapter of the character option chapter, what we call splats. But yeah, I mean, even just down to small headers or where we're putting sidebars and things like that, I've definitely found that my librarian background kicks in for that kind of thing. But it's interesting because I'm the original person who asked the question, I'm not sure if they were talking about the structure of where the information goes or like the layout, the visual layout, because they were asking where those decisions get made. I would say, yeah, on the structure of the actual information, you know, what's in each chapter and that kind of thing is usually the developer of the book. But as far as layout decisions, at least for a company like Onyx Path, where we have separate people to do those jobs, you know, we can put notes in the manuscript that say, hey, layout, it would be great if we could put this on the same page as that or something like that. But ultimately, the layout folks, you know, need to do what they need to do. If they need to move something, move a sidebar or move a piece of art or something like that to make something fit on a page, you know, that's their job.
Right. And actually, that's a good segue because Celador followed up mentioning specifically V5 Chicago by Night, and how the Kindred were presented in Chicago by Night was different from how V5 and Core had handled it. And I think it's a good example of both of those cases. I know Matthew Dawkins had worked with White Wolf, and apparently White Wolf Paradox was unhappy with how kind of it landed in V5, and so we want to do something better. And so Matthew had some ideas. There was a lot of iteration in terms of, even after drafts came in, of how do we phrase this? How do we work on this? I had some talks with Matthew because I had written a few characters and I had some ideas on how we could help with this front. But it was a kind of a strong iteration in terms of, like Justin said, like, it was like 7 or 8 versions of what these characters look like. And Matthew had to do the unenviable task of rearranging this information from already inherited drafts on like over 100 characters to make sure they all lined up.
That's a big point too, I think.
Yeah.
When you start talking about when a writer is writing, they're not necessarily just writing paragraphs of text, right? They're writing to fit a certain format here.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though a character background might be 400, 700 words, it's a pain in the ass to do because it needs to fit this particular format. And your word count is very efficient as opposed to very florid in a character layout.
That's absolutely true. And then Mike Chaney, who is a complete workhorse of layout at Onyx Path Publishing, had to not only take this new structure and make it look visually close to what was established in V5, but also, does it look good on the page? Does it? Because how people parse information, I've learned this from talking with people like Rich Thomas and Mike Chaney and other layout people at White Wolf, is that your brain picks up on visual cues as well. So like, oh wait, that character was like 3 or 4 pages around the picture of the guy getting punched by a vampire. So which page is that on? And then you use those as kind of reference points as you look through the book. And that's stuff, like Meghan says, that we can't possibly anticipate when we're writing the manuscript. It's just a Word document. So layout, they have to think about those things. Okay, this has been the same look for 7 or 8 pages. We need to break this up so that way it doesn't become just a slog of the same looking page over and over and over again. So, Mike has to think about things like, okay, let's give Lord of the Clans is a good example. I put all kind of mini clan books inside one big V20 book, and so I had to give different page treatments underneath each of the clan sections. So that way, and then I quickly glance, oh, I'm in the Giovanni section. I know we need to go later on to find the Ravnos section. So, but just by glancing at the color of the page, you immediately know what kind of section you're in. And again, so that's a lot of stuff that really does come from the layout side. And like Meghan says, we have ideas and thoughts, but usually they're far better, far stronger ideas from the artists and from the layout people than we could possibly have. So we did kind of jump over editing, but I just want to briefly mention that at least in companies like Onyx Path, usually we have a separate editor or editing team. And that's something I know we've always definitely encouraged, because if people who say, oh, I can just edit my own work, they're wrong. You're just wrong. Mm-hmm. You will look through mistakes. You will see things that you think are there that aren't there. So having another pair of eyes of any kind, even if it's a beta reader looking over your manuscript, is hugely helpful. And so having another person actually edit it after the developer does their own kind of editing pass is big. But then, it goes into art. And so we talked a little bit about, Dixie says in comments, don't edit your own work. So Dixie backs me up on this.
Well, I mean, you know what you're saying, right? So
right.
Any clarity issue isn't going to show up to you because you know what the point is. But
right.
If someone who's not you is trying to interpret it and is like, what is this? Then you need some editing, some rewrite.
Yeah, exactly. And as a developer, I've looked over every paragraph of this book 30 times by now. There is no way that I'm going to catch everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's another actually a good point is when you live inside a manuscript for as long as the developer does, you've probably read the same text 9, 10 times, from first draft, red lines, final draft, pre-editing layout, or pre-editing development, editing, post-editing developments. So by the time, you further the process, you're like, oh, I just know what it says. But there still may have been errors introduced. So yeah, having a separate set of eyes is definitely useful. So yeah, and then let's go into the art process. The relationship between the developer and art is complicated. I think it's fair to say. Usually, from my experience, there's art notes, documents, or some form of communicating to the artists what the look of the book's going to be, what kind of information in the book, because like Justin says, the artists are not going to be reading the whole manuscript. So you have to give them enough context so they understand what kind of art they're making. But also the art director is going to be making a lot of decisions that's they're just not going to check in with the developer on, because they have a better sense of what the aesthetics are going to look like, how these, this kind of picture just works better than the note you gave me. So I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts. Like, what has been your a relationship with art directors, positive or negative, in terms of how much should a developer be involved? Should they just let the art do their own thing, or should a developer completely control that process?
For my part, one of the things that I have always been served well by is letting people have their expertise, right? Your art director is an art director because they know how to art direct. It's my job to kind of call out highlights of, hey, this might make a cool illustration, or we really need to emphasize this point. But that's where my involvement ends, right? Trust your art director. It's like being in a nightclub. Trust the DJ. Best DJ knows what he's playing and responds to the floor. Your art director, A, knows these usability things, and so can direct the graphic designer. B, knows the kind of visual theme that's going to be used to unify the book. So, by all means, give them stuff to work with, but let them be excellent.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I've actually, so I'm not much of a visual person when it comes to that kind of thing. And so I've often Mike Chaney will send me an email and say, well, do you have any specifics on this thing? Like, what does this mean? And I'm like, you know what? Let the artist figure it out. They know better than I do. Like, I trust the artist to come up with something better than whatever I was going to come up with, because that's not what I do. The one thing I will say that I've had a really, really positive experience with Mike Chaney every single time. I love working with him. He absolutely knows what he's doing, and I trust his judgment. The one thing that I do tend to give more specific detail on when it comes to the art notes is things like ethnicity or gender or just diversity of people that show up in the art, because just in general, I want to be specific about that kind of thing. So just to make sure that when we get the art back and you look through the book, we see all of the variety of diverse people in the pages. And that was something that I was very, I wanted to make absolutely certain for Changeling that every piece of art that I thought about it first. Because, I mean, it's the same thing with we have something like a Night Horrors book where it has NPCs in it. I tell the writers up front, hey, think about this. But a lot of times the writer won't even, the text doesn't even specify, which is fine. Because then, I get to put in the art notes, I want this diverse cast of people in this book. So that's the one thing that I do get sort of very specific about. But everything else, I definitely trust the artists and the layout folks.
No, I completely agree, because in my experience, if you go to an artist and you don't specify, if they're generally a white man, they're probably going to put white men in there. And if they're not a white man, they're going to assume you want white men in there.
Yeah.
So by clarifying, no, really, I do want different kinds of people in this, and down to this is a Latino woman. She's sitting in a car next to a black man and they're doing blah, to be super transparent about those things. I agree. That's a point where developer needs to be kind of broadcast a bit more. I do know that one of my experiences with the let the artist do it was when I was working on New Wave Requiem for Vampire the Requiem with Craig Grant. He did the usual, here's a manuscript. It was an 80s themed source book. And he's like, cool, what's the cover look like? And everyone was like, I don't know. There's a very kind of powerful looking person. And there's two people, dying down on one knee in front of her and blah, blah, blah. And frankly, it was very generic vampire looking art description. I was still relatively new in my career. And so Kirk was like, so I'm just going to ignore all of this and I have a better idea. And it's like, you know what? You do you. And he found a particular artist who did kind of a Nagel-esque style, which is very, very popular in the 80s. and came back with a piece that is frankly one of the best pieces of art I've seen for Vampire the Red Queen.
Iconic cover. I mean, that is such fantastic.
So good.
I can see that cover spot on in my head.
Yeah, and everyone I've talked to has been like, "Oh my god, that cover's amazing," and I get a lot of credit for it. And it's like I had zero to do with that. It's all Craig Grant. Craig was like, "No, you're wrong, and let me just go ahead and do this better for you." And it's like, "Please, thank you, Craig, because I don't know what I'm doing." But I do know, like for new games, sometimes that conversation can get really tricky. Like for Pugmire, to go back to Justin's point about video game developments, Rich Thomas and I actually did kind of a video game style pass where he did a lot of concept art for it. We talked a lot about the world of Pugmire and what the characters look like and how they act and how they dress and how they eat. And these are all things that Rich couldn't just make up. He had to have my input on them. And so we got into lengthy conversations about parts of the world that I had no clue I would be discussing. But then he would sketch something up in a book. And sometimes we were actually at conventions. We'd sit next to each other, like having, coffee or a beer or whatever. He would sketch something up, show it to me, and I'd make some comments. He'd make another sketch and show it to me, which is unusual, but it was a very good process. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Pugmire art direction has been so consistently solid, is because Rich and I spent that time up front to actually have the discussion. That was one of the rare times where that was more of a design thing, a developer thing, but certainly I, as the designer/developer, had a lot of input and impact on the art. But also, I trust Rich completely with direction. If Rich just said, I have an idea and go with it, I would have been fine with it. But he wanted to make sure he was getting the right elements to it.
That's a really fortunate luxury you've had there too, because one of the things that I've noticed over time is that a lot of game writers are working for basically whatever project comes up for them. So they aren't necessarily always siloed into, this is a vampire writer and this person only writes vampire and this person gets vampire perfectly. You're working with people who are also writing for D&D and have their own indie project going and who also work on this other thing to pay the bills. And so, it's at that point that the developer becomes a necessary voice for, no, we're not that technical, emphasize mood here, or, whatever it is that's in the DNA of that particular game that really needs to be pulled out and emphasized, maybe even called out to an art director. I'm sure, art directors have the same, not issue, but the same sort of experience with artists where, we've used before, artists who have worked on high fantasy properties, and okay, there's less of a need for that. Go moodier for vampire as opposed to the high fantasy, action and adventure sorts of things of it. So all of that needs to be carefully molded, and that's kind of starts with the developer.
Yeah, absolutely true. So we have about a little over 10 minutes left. So as people, if you have thoughts and comments, go ahead and start throwing them in the chat. I'm going to scroll back and hit a couple of high points of things that we were kind of, as we were talking. Burnt Neal says he never needs editing. Sometimes I'll read my own work when it's been published and don't even remember fixing the errors, which means Neal is a liar. So I just want to make sure that's clear on the record that Neal's a liar. C.A. Berlitz, also curious about how all this can relate for very small publishers when one person may have to do much more than one task. And that's actually a really good point. What it's like to wear multiple hats. I think we've all done that. So do you guys have any initial thoughts about what you have to do when you have to do more than one thing your own?
I haven't done that. I've always been a part of big commercial endeavors, so I always have an art department to rely on. So I don't know.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I haven't really, I mean, as far as, obviously a developer does wear different hats, but I haven't really done, any layout or art or any of that kind of stuff. So.
Okay, that's fair. Honestly, I've only really started doing it myself on projects like Pugmire, because that is creator owned. So it's like I felt like I needed to be involved at least on some level for everything. But also I've worked with some indie game companies, like a video game side, where it's like, okay, we need you to write this, but also can you design this, and also can you give comments to the translators, and also can you give commentary on the art. And usually I find that if you are a really small shop or if you have a small team, if some people are going to be involved in most things, just having everyone involved in everything usually helps, because again, getting more eyes on things. If you have just 2 or 3 people, just say, hey, can we just look at this and give me a couple of comments on it, make sure I'm not, going off in the weeds in the wrong direction, can really help. Getting also pulling an idea from novelists, getting beta readers, people that you trust to look over your manuscript and say, this is making sense, this is flowing, does this work out well? You can do something equivalent when you're in a small shop to like look over, is this layout looking right? Can you share like a page or two with trusted friends and say, okay, is this clear? Would this be clearer than this? Give some examples. Just there are ways you can get people involved without having to necessarily break the budget or hire whole departments for them. But also, I think to larger points you said is that if you can find people who are excellent at their job and you can afford to pay them, like get a Kickstarter or something together, it is definitely worth the extra effort if you could do that. So finding the pain points in your own process, things that you don't do well, and finding talented people to help fill those goals, I think will be a huge part of it. And so talking about this process, talking about all of the things that are involved and figuring out, oh, hey, I'm not great at art. I'm not a visual person. So let me hire someone who's a visual person or work with someone who's a visual person and fill that need.
I don't think there's any doubt that we're working basically in a creative field here. And what you are talking about here starts to get into kind of the different categories of design and development and even creative direction. And on the one hand, you've got kind of the creative tornado, who's the idea guy who has their fingers involved in every piece of the pie. Hey, this is art, but as the creative director, I have this opinion on it. I'm more of the kind of project manager style of designer and developer, where, I know there's this and this needs to be handed off here. So my involvement with it ends here, except for giving a little bit of, guidance. And so like how everyone individually looks at their project, it might not even be their project, especially as things start to scale up. I've been script writer on projects where, I'm employee number 600 working on the project.
Right.
And I've also been, at the front and center where everything begins with me. So there's a huge difference between, what you're working on and is this an ensemble piece of work, or is this kind of an auteur's vision that they're bringing across the goal line?
Absolutely. And neither one is wrong. It just depends on what the project needs.
Well, being the creative tornado was wrong because you just end up.
Okay, fair. No, that is true. No. I believe the term I remember was pigeon manager. The guy who flies in, shits all over everything, and leaves.
Yes. Yes.
Dragon Elvish asked, does the writer enter as part of the production, or are we talking about the head of production team? I'm not sure I understand the question there. I think what's being asked is like, is the writer introduced into production, or is the writer head of production? And I feel like nearly every developer I've worked with is at some level a writer. So I mean, certainly it's a case of you have to have some writing skills to understand what other writers need to know to be able to contribute to the project. But I mean, it helps if you have like a little bit of at least a sense of what art might work for a game, a little sense of how to edit a product. I mean, so picking up those kind of ad hoc skills to help kind of at least intelligently communicate to other people certainly helps. I know like when I was working in video games, learning a little bit of Python really helped me to communicate with engineers as they're working on a project, because then I could talk. I couldn't make a program from scratch, but certainly I could say, okay, I think it's like this. I think we're talking about an object-oriented thing here, and then go, oh, okay, cool. And they can connect to what you're trying to say better, and then they can carry it across the line. So having enough to be able to start the conversation helps. But I think a writer certainly, if the writer is coming in, having the writing skills is really useful at the development stage, I feel, because again, you're trying to take someone's vision, whether it's yours or somebody else's, and translate it into a manuscript and a book. Neil has
one way to think of it too, I think is anytime you're making a game, it's a ship, and that ship needs to arrive. So everyone who is on the ship is doing their part. And, it may be as simple as we're all rowing. And if I start rowing in the opposite direction, or if I take my oar and I'm waving it around and I'm not even rowing, I'm not helping the ship get to its destination. And I think that's true of any creative endeavor. And it, I think, does scale up. Maybe you're rowing a rowboat, or maybe you're rowing a galleon. But everybody needs to help make sure that the project being worked on is getting to where it's going. And if you're working against that, you're not helping it arrive at the destination.
Yeah, and I'd say too that I agree with Eddie that it is important for a developer to have to have those writing skills, especially, I mean, there may be a point at the end where you're going through the post-editing development and you say, oh, I need to rewrite this, and you just rewrite it yourself. I mean, that kind of thing happens. But I think it's also really important for a developer to have project management skills
Yeah,
too, on
fair.
top of the writing skills. I know that for me, like I was in project management for years, and so it was a kind of a natural transition for me. But a lot of writers become developers and go, oh, wait a minute, there's so many more administrative tasks here that I'm used to, or there's so much more that I need to think about now, than just how is this section written and what goes into the text.
Completely agree. All right. So one question I have for everyone on the panel is that in Megan's case, for some reason, you've been told you can never develop an RPG again. In Justin's case, it's been, okay, you need to stop thinking around RPGs and focus on your other career or whatever. What do you say to that? Do you feel like being an RPG developer has been a huge part of your life? Do you feel like it's impacted you in a distinct way? Or is it just something you can sit down and go, you know what, I'm on to a new thing now?
Megan,
you were first in the sequence there, so I defer to you.
Okay. No, I feel like it's a huge part of my life. I actually relatively recently went full time on freelancing, and am picking up more development work now than before. And I mean, it's one of those things where I've kind of been making games my whole life without realizing that was what I was doing. And so I know that if somebody said, well, you can never develop an RPG again, I would just still be doing it and just not publishing them. Like my brain just does that. So yeah, I mean, I do feel like it's a large part of what I do.
Yeah, for me, it's a question of the creative satisfaction that comes out of it. And I have never been so creatively satisfied as I was when I was working on Vampire, first and foremost. And I don't mean that to cast other work in a different light. You know, I've loved the work I did on Assassin's Creed. I loved being able to work in VR, social VR, and be able to kind of develop what nobody knew and kind of find out, oh, people like to play like this. But there is a difference between making what people buy and making something that somebody loves. You know, when people tell me that, oh, this game, I found my the person I married through this game, or this game helped me find my sexuality, or it got me through a really difficult time. Like, that's something that Assassin's Creed, my work on Assassin's Creed, probably isn't going to help anybody do. Right. But, you know, if I was able to be that important, and even, you know, not necessarily they recognize and acknowledge me for it, but if the game was that to somebody, that's awesome. I've helped someone live their life, and that's, I think, beautiful to me. And so if I never get to do it again, kind of like what Megan was saying, you know, I don't necessarily know that I would keep making secret unpublished games, but I would take that into the games that I play, right? So, you know, when we get together to play a game, I would push that creative effort into, you know, satisfying the people at the table, hopefully.
Yeah,
I completely agree.
Sorry, just the same thing that Justin was saying, that working on Changeling the Lost has been huge for that kind of thing, because so many people love that game so much, and it has helped a lot of people sort of figure out things about themselves or work through something through playing the game. And it is a kind of creative satisfaction, but also just something that none of my work previously has ever brought to me before, and it's amazing.
I 100% with everything you guys are saying. I know that there are certainly times where the internet can be cruel, or, you know, it feels like you're talking in a void and there's nothing else going on. But then you find that one tweet, you get that one email, you find that one person at a convention that tells you how much your work means to them, and that's what gets me through. And every time, I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah.
So many people have come to me, you know, like Justin said, about discovering about their lives through Vampire. More recently, so many people coming to me, it's like, you know, thank you for having a game like Pugmire right now at a time where things are so difficult in the world. I've had people come to me talk about how their kids have become, you know, have started to internalize social mores through the idea of being a good dog. Those really mean a ton to me, and knowing that I can make something and it gets out in the world in a relatively short period of time, and with a small creative team, the fact that you can almost see who has what hands on what piece is satisfying. I mean, like, you know, like Justin said, I mean, I've also worked on AAA projects, and it's satisfying in a different way, but also it's really hard to say that's my bit, you know, because it's such a huge team. It's a huge team effort. And so it's like, yeah, someone may really love that game, but also you're one of like 50, 100, 300 people who contributed to that. Whereas if you're one of 3 or 4, then it's like, okay, wow, that's a big part of me on that page, big part of me in that book that you're really gravitating to. So we are just about out of time. So thank everyone else in the chat for hanging out and giving great questions. Megan, where can people find you online?
They can find me on Twitter at Fitzmorigna, Fitzmorrigna.
Justin?
I am at JACHILLI on Twitter. I have a poor, neglected blog somewhere, but I'm not even going to say the URL. So let's forget about that.
I remember that blog. It was cool. And you can find me on Twitter at Pugsteady, PUGEDDY. Or you can find me at my website at Pugsteady, PUGSTEADY, because I'm contrary. I don't know why I did that. Yeah, but otherwise, thank you guys for hanging out. Appreciate your time to give us this panel. Also, thanks all of you for attending Virtual Horror Con, and also thank you so much for all your donations. I'm sure that the COVID-19 Response Fund really appreciates all of your money and your time with us. So thank you all so much, and we'll move on to the next panel. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, y'all.